So what I wanted to do now was give you a demonstration of how 1 and 2-point perspective work, because that'll apply directly to how things happen in the Renaissance and how we think about looking at paintings. So let's start with 1-point perspective. In 1-point perspective, you basically have this line across the picture plane that's called the horizon line, and you have a little dot in the center of that space. We'll make it a little mark here. And that dot is called the vanishing point. So this horizontal line is called the horizon line. It's where the sky meets the earth. And this dot here is the point at which things vanish, and it's called the vanishing point. If you have a block or a cube sitting in front of this vanishing point, we'll draw that in for you. Basically what happens is you get to only see the front and the top of this cube, and the way that it works with 1-point perspective is it's actually a sort of mathematical proportion in which things recede at a regular rate towards that vanishing point on the horizon. So you can see it looks like a block that goes back infinitely in space. So if you were to draw a line across the top of this that was parallel with the horizon line, and you erase the spaces in between, so for instance, we erase this line, doesn't it kind of look like that box makes some sort of sense? Now what they figured out in the Renaissance is you can use actually the lines that you drew already to continue this box infinitely back into space. So let's draw, for instance, the top of the box behind it, and you drop verticals off. Draw another one behind it, and what starts to happen is you actually have a bunch of boxes that relate to one another and actually will seem to make sense in proportion to one another. If you have a box off to the side, you get to see 3 sides of it. So let's just draw another box here. The lines will recede off to the vanishing point. And it kind of makes sense then, right? So you can actually draw an infinite amount of boxes going back in space to this vanishing point on the horizon just by duplicating a square box. Please excuse the fact that I'm doing a lot of this by freehand. And if you erase the lines, these boxes make sense in reference to one another. Now, if a box rises above the horizon line, we can do that over here. You don't get to see the top, and you don't get to see actually sort of like this one. You don't get to see the top of it because what goes above the horizon line is above the eye line. So we'll continue to draw the forms off to that horizon line or that vanishing point. We can subdivide that, and we can continue to make boxes that are overlapping one another just by making lines that are supposed to be horizontal to each other or parallel to each other. And then we'll just erase out the things that don't make sense in terms of this. So you can't see through this box, right? Now, they actually figured out in the Renaissance that if you do this kind of thing, one of the things that you can actually figure out how to do is things can be in proportion to one another. So let's see if I can flatten this object. Okay. I don't know why it's not letting me do that. Now in the Renaissance, one of the things that they figured out how to do was actually that now the other thing that they started to notice was that when they would use this system called linear perspective or one-point perspective where things would recede to one vanishing point in the background. If they shaded these things using the principles of chiaroscuro that we discussed earlier, it would seem that the things had more volume and that they would actually make more sense, and that the picture plane itself was unified because the light seemed to come from the upper right-hand corner and rake across objects and cast shadows, so it made it even more illusionistic. Later on, they actually even figured out that if they added the addition of changing the contrast from the foreground to the background, for instance, the foreground would be a higher contrast and have more darks and lights, and the background would become lighter as it moved towards the horizon. What they figured out was this was called atmospheric perspective, or sfumato, in which the air and the vapor and the particles of water in the air interfered with the ability to see light, and so things became bluer and lighter as they reached the horizon, or the vanishing point on the horizon line. Figuring out size-scale relationships in inanimate objects like boxes makes a lot of sense, and so Renaissance artists also figured out that they could use that same system to figure out even how tall or short people should be as they move into the background. So for instance, you just start with two guidelines, and then you draw your first figure into that guideline, and then you draw another figure, and you make that figure fit within that sort of those two parallel lines or seemingly parallel lines that converge on the vanishing point in the background. And then you can even add one in the background. If you want to get even fancier, you can actually lighten it up as it moves back and use that sfumato to make it seem as if it even has more depth and more volume. Now, two-point perspective is a little bit different because in one-point perspective, the front of the box is parallel to the top of the picture plane or the horizon line, and the sides of the front of the box are parallel to the left and right-hand sides of the picture plane. In two-point perspective, you've got a slightly different kind of notion, and things become sort of weird obliques and parallelograms. So let's start by taking a look at this. You start first by having a horizon line, and then you add 2 points on that horizon line that are the vanishing points. The leading edge of the box is a vertical that's parallel with the sides, but then you draw a series of lines that lead off to the edges that lead to the first vanishing point and then to the second vanishing point. And then you cross those lines by adding other verticals that stand for the backs of the box. Then again, from the corners of those boxes, you draw another series of lines that lead off to the vanishing point. Now you can use these guidelines also to create boxes that are behind that one that are proportional to the box in front of it and recede at a sort of systematic rate. And this is where the math kind of comes in, but you don't actually have to figure out with numbers. So you draw another vertical line, and you draw lines from that vertical line the same way you did with the box in the front off to the vanishing point. And you can continue to do that so that you have a complete box that's behind it. And eventually what you end up having is actually an image that is a series of boxes that make sense to one another on the picture plane. Now, if you erase all of the extra lines on this, what you eventually have is two boxes that make a lot of sense without all the guidelines. And it's sort of a magic. In the Renaissance, they thought that this was an incredible innovation, and it is, and all the video games you guys play use this thing. Now, what happens when the box rises above the horizon line? Well, let's take a look at that next. What you do is you draw another vertical, and because it's above the horizon line, you actually don't see the top of it. So you draw, again, a series of lines that go off to the two vanishing points. And then vertical lines that stand for the back sides of the box. And then the next thing that you do is you erase out those lines, and you have 3 boxes on a plane that relate to one another in a system that's proportional. And if you were to add light and shadow, let's add a light source from the upper left-hand side and draw some cast shadows. What you have is a system of linear perspective combined with chiaroscuro that makes a complete illusion of a real space. And it unifies the picture plane, the light and shadow the chiaroscuro does, and so does the 2-point linear perspective.